Hey, this is Derek. I want to make a very important video about conflict and tension. I made a video a while ago about the 3 types of conflict that I think are really important to have in your novel. I talked a little bit about those, but I realized recently just putting the right things in your book isn't enough to create the dramatic tension that you want. And there are some specific reasons for that, so I kind of thought through it deeper than I have in the past. I don't think anyone's really talked about these specific issues before, so I hope they're really helpful for you. But I want to kind of define the difference between conflict and tension. Conflict is what actually happens in the story. So you put 2 things together. Usually it's characters, but it could be just be any kind of opposition. I like to say that my characters should be oppressed, which means whatever they're trying to do, they can't do the thing that they want to do. Something stops them. That's the conflict. It can be other characters who disagree. It could be the antagonists. Could be allies who just want other things. Could be world stuff that's happening, like I said, earthquakes or storms or whatever. Something stopping them from getting what they want. That's oppression. That's conflict. It's stuff that happens on the stage that stops your protagonists from getting what they want. And it's important, but it's not enough, because if you just keep adding conflict, readers won't really care about what happens, and you don't have any dramatic intrigue. You don't have any tension. So tension is something a little different. Tension is what could happen. So this video is mostly going to talk about tension, but 2 main points, which I think are kind of awesome. Dialogue is the enemy of tension. What I see happening a lot, especially in like early versions of, chapter 1, chapter 2, I kind of coach people into having more conflict, and I give them situations like, you should add this should happen, because then you'll have all this conflict, you'll have all this tension. But you can add those details without creating any dramatic tension. And that's because what a lot of authors do is they just resolve the tension right away. If you have people talking, if you have characters get together and talk, and they share the story information, the background information, so that readers know what's going on and that the characters know what's going on, that's a tension killer. If characters know what's happening, or if like they talk with someone, if any kind of dialogue, if they see someone over there, they don't know what that person's doing, and they're like, hey, what's up? And they talk to each other, then the tension's gone, the conflict's gone. There's no conflict once they've talked to each other. If your characters talk about shit, you're killing the tension and the conflict in the scene, because tension is what could happen. As long as you give readers too much information, if you tell them what's really going on, you're killing all the tension. So that's the first one. Conversation and confrontation are the enemy of tension. That stuff has to happen way, way later. You have to have a lot of near misses where there's a lot of dramatic tension, but the characters don't actually talk to each other. Because if they actually sat down and talked to each other, they would just understand what's going on, their motivations, and once they understand, the tension is gone. That's number 1. Number 2 is all conflict is unplanned, which means the characters don't know what's going to happen. They're not expecting the bad things to happen. All the conflict that happens in your book is unexpected. It's stuff that's they're hoping doesn't happen, because smart characters don't plan to put themselves in danger. They don't plan to go in, and have the maximum confrontation or conflict. Smart characters try to avoid conflict. And so if you just try to put conflict into every scene, and tension in every scene, but then they just sit down and talk about it, or they make a plan to diffuse it, what happens is you'll allow your characters to avoid all the conflict and all the tension. And as soon as you get rid of it, it's gone. Like if you set up, I've seen this happen a lot recently, but if you set up all this tension, you put this thing in your book that's great dramatic tension, but then when it actually happens, it just fizzles out. There's nothing really there, because you didn't write a tight gripping scene. You haven't hooked into the emotion. When good tension happens, the main characters hate each other. They feel guilty. They feel this gripping pain and loss and frustration. No matter what they tried to avoid, they've made everything worse. That's a really good tension. They should feel bad about things. They should feel personally responsible for the bad things that happened that they didn't do on purpose, but it still happens because of things that they did. So moving on a little bit, this is kind of the way that it works in practice. Something happens that kicks off your story. It's not something that the protagonist probably planned. The protagonist might have been trying to do something, and this was an unfortunate accident, but something they didn't foresee happens. The character doesn't know what's going on yet. It's something unusual. It's something out of the ordinary, different from their ordinary world. This is probably like the inciting incident early on in the book. You kind of set everything up with a really good first chapter. The first chapter is only to get people to like your main character and to be interested in the world building that you're doing. But something dramatic and sudden and shocking has to happen probably near the end of chapter 1 that the main character didn't expect. But the main character doesn't know why any of that happened. They have to have the question words, the who, what, why, where, how, the 5 question words. The character should have to figure this stuff out. They don't know who, what, why, where, how. They don't know why this happened, who did it, where they should go next. They might have to make a plan, but right now they're reeling with doubt, frustration, uncertainty, fear. It's the tension arises out of their not knowing. As soon as you give them answers, you've killed the story. You've killed the tension. Answers need to come with the reveals. You should know, what's going on. You should know the background information. You should know who the antagonists are and what their plan is. But the characters don't need to know this, especially in the first half. You want to save the big reveals to like the midpoint. The characters shouldn't know who the main antagonists are until the midpoint, and they shouldn't actually get the real revelation until like the final battle or the Dark Night of the Soul. Just before the Dark Night of the Soul is like 3/4 into the novel where they actually get the real full truth about what's going on, and suddenly they realize how much deeper this all goes, how great the stakes are against them. Anyway, so the really important thing with tension is not giving the information. It's to withhold the information and focus on the scene, focus on the conflict in the scene, focus on the characterization, the background, the scenery, make it all amazing and awesome, but don't reveal too much information too quickly. Slowly drip out information throughout the first, half of the novel, where every time they learn something new, you've already hooked them strong enough in the beginning with some of these action scenes. They don't know what's happening or why it's happening or how they're involved or what the antagonists want or what they should do next. They always have to make a plan, a failed plan based on their limited knowledge, based on just a guess, like, let's try to figure this shit out. And they make, a step forward, and then they come across something else terrible, bad happens that pushes them a little bit forward. And they might always be, uncovering a new piece of information that leads them in a new direction, but they're not getting like the whole 411 or whatever you call it. They're not getting all the information. You have to hold the information back. So it's a big mistake in the first couple chapters to just dump a bunch of information dumps where the characters are just talking about all the backstory and setting up all the world, and this is all the conflict and all that, these are the stakes and the players, and this is what the antagonists want. You want to hold all that stuff back and focus on the dramatic tension and conflict in a scene, which is just, what's happening. We don't know. You have to give readers a little bit of satisfaction, because if you withhold too much stuff too long and they're confused, then they'll give up, they'll quit. So you have to kind of be slow dripping, slow feeding them something, so that the story is progressing forward and the protagonist is moving forward. But you want it to be going somewhere, but you don't want to be giving everything away. So anyway, something happens. The protagonist has doubt, fear, uncertainty. They make a plan to figure something out, or to make a step forward, or to respond to whatever bad things have been happening. They have a goal, but they don't really know what's going to happen. They hope, they'll be able to avoid future conflict. They hope they'll be able to resolve the stuff. At the same time, you have to show really big stakes. So you have to show what's the worst that could possibly happen. What are they afraid of? Why are they taking any action at all? If there's nothing dangerous, if there's no reason for them to take action, if there's no stakes, they won't do anything. There has to be real physical stakes. What's the word? permanent stakes. They have to have like the danger of death of the character or death of the family, even if it's not a literal death, like a psychological death of the self, of their own identity, which is generally the way it is in like contemporary fiction or literary fiction. They're trying to hold on to the status quo and like the life that they've built, and they don't want to be pushed into new territories. They don't want to go off, into a new adventure. They're trying to hold on to what they already have. The worst that can happen is, they lose their job, they lose someone they care about. You have to show what's the worst that can happen. In something like a dystopian, you want to show real stakes. So in one of the stories I'm working on, one of the characters, she's kind of a thief. So if she's going to steal something, you have to show what happens to thieves in that world. So one of the things I suggested to build the tension is that she is basically being forced to go on this mission to steal stuff, and it's a very dangerous mission. And her love interest, boyfriend, friend-zoned character, doesn't want her to go, and he thinks he can save her by stealing something valuable for her to kind of buy her freedom. But what happens is he gets caught. So he gets a finger cut off, which is the stakes of the story. Like thieves get their fingers cut off. But instead of just happening to like some person, which would be okay. Like if they were in a market and, some thief got caught and got her finger cut off, that would be all right. But if it's not a real character, it's not really going to matter to, it's not going to matter to readers. So it's not going to have the same emotional appeal as if it was really happening to an actual character they care about. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to matter to the protagonist. So to make this really matter, this is her best friend who did something for her. And so she basically says, why did you do this? This was stupid. And that's his chance to say, I've always loved you. I don't want you to leave. You're the only good thing. So it's like he's a friend zone character who confesses his love to her and loses a finger right before she has to go off on this mission anyway. So she has all this other conflict and guilt. She doesn't know if she likes him that way, but now he's like sacrificed a finger for her. So she has all this guilt and responsibility. It could be a really dramatic scene if done well, but only if the tension is built into the scene, because you could also put those features in that scene without it having any emotional impact. You have to make sure when you describe this stuff that your protagonist is reeling from the emotional impact, that they feel. I see novels sometimes that just don't describe the emotions. They have to feel them, a pounding headache, they feel sick to their stomach, that all this, like the physical pains of what they're going through, because this is such a dramatic, shocking incident. That's really important. You can't just like show the stuff. You have to focus on the emotion as well, and you have to really make it matter to your central characters and your protagonists. But anyway, show the stakes. Now, like with that set up, we know the stakes of what happens to potential thieves in her world. Another example from the same book, she sees somebody else on the downworld. This is kind of like a, incognito story. Like she has to dress up to pretend to be wealthy, to be a fraud in the magical academy so she can start stealing stuff. So there has to be huge stakes for her failing, for her being uncovered, for someone to figure out who she really is. It has to matter, in a really real way, not just, physical pain, not only she'll be punished or she'll be put to death. It has to matter because she's trying to protect somebody else, or she's threatened. Like if she doesn't pull off this mission, then they're going to kill her little brother, or they're going to kill her love interest, or something terrible is going to happen to somebody she cares about. She has to have a reason that it matters for her not to get uncovered. So one of the things we did to boost the tension is that somebody she recognizes from down below where she comes from, she saw somebody else down below, and now she saw the same person up above in this floating, world where the mages live. That's a huge bit of tension because, they can make eye contact with each other and she can be, shit, that person knows who I am. What am I going to do about that? Is she going to tell anybody? She should be like panicking and not sleeping. And she has to like find a way to get that person alone and talk to her and make sure she's not going to say anything. And what's that person even doing up here? Who is she? Why is she also, up here? You have to focus on the questions. You have to vote. The tension comes in the not knowing. As soon as you have a confrontation scene where the protagonist and this mystery woman actually get together and talk with each other, as soon as they like say, I won't tell my secret if you don't tell your secret, then the tension is gone. It's a diffused situation because the risk is gone. The risk comes from the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen. So you have to try to keep that uncertainty growing. And also, once you create a tense situation, you want it to keep building. So for example, in this situation where she sees this other woman who she knows her secret, and she's scared, she's panicked. You don't want to resolve it. You want to up the stakes. You want to keep building the tension. You want to string it along as possible. So you might see that lady talking to the headmistress, or you might see that lady talking to the police and pointing at her and laughing. You want to keep showing like even greater instances that freak her out. Be like, shit, is she telling someone about me? Is she making plans behind my back? You would have, like, instead of de-escalating, you would escalate. You would have maybe, for example, this other lady could say, I am going to tell on you unless you do something else for me, unless you steal something else from me. So instead of having one mission, now she has two missions, because not only does she have to steal something to protect her friends and family, but now she has to steal something else or do something else challenging or dangerous, so that she doesn't get turned in by this totally accidental threat, by a new threat. So you're always trying to create more tensions, more problems, and you don't want to have a conversation where there's a chance where they can de-escalate. You want to have more intrigue, more conflict, and be building it and make it harder and harder for your main character. It's not enough to have like one impossible task. You have to give them 3 impossible tasks that they have to choose between, and there's no way that they can be successful at all of them. One of them they're going to have to fail, and if they fail any of them, something terrible is going to happen. And eventually, you do want them to fail. You want to set up the stakes and show like what's the worst that can happen. You want them to be terrified, and you want them to be thinking about like, oh no, this can't happen, because if this happens, this terrible thing's going to happen. You want them to really feel that in their gut, and then you want it to happen anyway. You want the worst thing that could happen to happen anyway, because you want to put your characters in greater danger, in more conflict. You want to put them deeper and deeper in trouble until the end, until like the very end scene where all the conflict comes out and there's a final battle scene. All the conflict and tension that you've been setting up actually comes to a head. And you also have to be really careful about false conflict. So false conflict is like, there's a saying, I forget who said it, but as soon as you put a gun in a scene, if there's a gun in a scene, that gun has to be used by the end of the book. There has to be, like, the firearm that you show has to be discharged. Whatever you show to build the tension, for example, like I often put a knife in my book that doesn't have to be there, but like she finds a knife under her pillow or something. It just creates the tension, but eventually at the end of the book, the knife should be instrumental. It should be it should be an important feature of the resolution of the conflict. So if something happens, if you hint towards some danger, some weapon, some disaster, whatever, you have to let the disaster go off and play out before the end of the book. So dialogue, confrontation, it's the enemy of tension. Also, you want to build up your who, what, why, how story questions until the big reveals. The big reveals, the big twists, those will only really hit pay dirt if you've been building up the story questions. So you don't want to reveal them in the first couple chapters. You want to build them up until the big reveals, halfway through the book or towards the end of the book, when the antagonist is doing the hero or the victim of the antagonist, the villain speech, where the villain reveals all the stuff, and tells all the answers just before the final conflict. You want to build all that stuff up, and you want to have your protagonist wondering about this stuff and trying to find answers and not finding answers, or you want to have them thinking one thing and then they can be surprised by something else when the truth finally comes out. Done well, story twists are really important. So you have to be careful. Like you want to plant some clues, but you don't want to make it obvious enough that readers know what's happening. You want to make sure that when readers get to the twists, it doesn't seem ridiculous. You don't want to invent a magical solution. So you don't want to invent like suddenly, magic happens and the protagonist magically does this thing to solve all the conflict. You want to make sure you've set up the ending so that it's possible for the characters to defeat the antagonists somehow using whatever means you've built up through the course of the novel, so that it makes sense and that it's reasonable. But you don't want it to be just so obvious that the readers already know what's going to happen. If they already know what's going to happen, they're going to be disappointed, even if it's a good book. If they predicted it in chapter 3, it's still going to be disappointing. You want to make sure the twists hit hard because they're a surprise, because readers didn't know what was going to happen. So that's point one, is just that be careful about dialogue or confrontation too early in your book where characters are just talking about stuff. You may think that you're providing readers with necessary story information. Actually, you really need to remove the story information and focus on the scene. Focus on conflict and tension in the scene, because things are actually happening. With those 3 points of conflict I talked about in an earlier video, which is the interior, exterior, and like friendly fire or lateral conflict. You focus on that conflict, but it's not resolved conflict. It's dramatic tension because they don't know what's going on. Anyway, so you want to try to not give away too much too early, and you want to be careful about having characters just talk to each other, because generally that's not a good thing to do, especially like even with romantic tension. You don't want your main characters to confess their feelings for each other until maybe the very end of the book. You want to string it out as long as possible, where there's a lot of dramatic tension, sexual tension. They're attracted to each other, but they can't be together. They don't know if they like each other in that way. There's got to be all this misunderstanding and confusion. You build the tension by focusing on the who, what, why, where, how questions, and having your protagonist ask questions and wonder about stuff. A note on that in a second, but you want to have them wondering about stuff without finding the information. But also, one thing I just realized I should also mention, you want to be careful about having your protagonist predict the actual resolution too early. Something I also see a lot of times is the main character wonders about something that's too spot on and is actually exactly what happened. So like in the second or third chapter, the main character's like, oh, I wonder if the antagonist is this guy, and if he's secretly working for the vampires, and if this is their plot or whatever. If you don't want them to accurately guess the resolution of the novel, you want them to wonder what's happening. You don't want them to be so specific that's like, I wonder if this is true, and then actually that's the case, because you've just given away the ending. So you want to be careful about that, about being too spot on. If you have them wonder things, have them wonder something else. Have them distract a little bit, or not, actually focus on the real solution. So the second point I think is important is that all conflict is unplanned. You may have different thoughts on this. You can comment if you think that I'm wrong about this. I haven't really thought it through that deeply, but I think it's a pretty good point. In that, this is kind of what happens. Something goes wrong, something happens to your main character, they don't know what it is, starts a story question, who, what, why, where, how. They're trying to figure out some answer and get back to that status quo, but they can't because they're always forced to go deeper into this conflict. Everything they try to do is digging their own grave. Basically, every time they try to fix something, 2 more things break, and they get deeper and deeper in the hole until there's no possible chance of solution. However, while they're creating all these dramas and dramatic tension and problems for themselves, they're also becoming stronger. They're making allies. They're learning more about what's really going on. They're starting to unravel the mystery. There's a couple big twists. There's a couple big battle scenes. But mainly, she should be trying to avoid conflict as much as possible. I say she because most of my protagonists are female, but it could be he or she. Smart protagonists don't plan real conflict. They may have a battle scene. They may be trying to like go and win a battle. They may plan on, there's going to be some violence happening, but they don't plan on making it harder than it should be. They want to make it as easy as possible. They plan to sneak in without getting caught or to steal something without getting caught. They don't plan to go to jail or whatever. So your job as an author is to figure out what they're going to do to try to solve the story questions of who, what, why, where, how, without giving away all the information or actually giving them answers. You want to push them down the path of the story quest without resolving all the story questions. But at the same time, you are always hitting them with conflict. So conflict are the stumbling blocks. I mentioned oppression earlier, but it's for everything that they want to do, you should invent 3 things that make it impossible to do that thing. So if they want to go from point A to point B, it's possible, if it's not necessary for the story, you could just skip the transition and they could just, they decide to do this and then you skip and the next scene starts in the middle of the action when they're actually doing that thing. But what I see a lot of people doing is they just cut through the action too quickly. So the first, you get to the final conflict scenes in the first couple chapters, and then you don't know what to do with your book. So to make a book actually work, you have to be inventing conflict all the way through. Every time they have one step, you have to invent 3 sources of conflict, and not even the main 3 sources of the exterior, interior, and lateral conflict I talked about earlier, but just bad stuff that makes it more difficult for them to achieve their quest. So if they have to go to point B, they have, antagonists that attack them. Then they have to go through a swamp. Then someone steals all their supplies. Then one of the main characters gets a leg broken. Then there's an eclipse and, whatever. You have to keep making up bad shit happen to them so that it's difficult, so that they have to work hard and struggle. That's kind of what story is. That's what fiction is. So you have to keep making conflict happen. But the conflict is unplanned for your protagonist. It's stuff that your protagonist didn't foresee, or even if they foresaw it, even if they prepared for it, it's still worse than they expected, and they're not totally capable of handling it. Because if it was just easy, it wouldn't be conflict. If it was just something bad happens and the main character's like, okay, fine, I'll just solve that with my magic, and then they move on, or okay, fine, luckily nothing bad happened, luckily nobody got hurt. You don't want to make it easy for your characters. You want to make them fail. You want to frustrate them. You want to create more and more conflict and injury, so that things are getting worse and worse all the time. There's a famous, I don't know what it is about writing, but something like put the cat in the tree, put your characters in a tree, throw things at them, and then get them down. That's the basic story module. Another one I've heard is put your characters in soup and turn up the heat, or keep turning up the heat. Something like that. But the story happens because you're creating conflict for your characters. Conflict is unplanned. Tension is your characters trying to understand what's happening but without getting answers. Tension happens because of the fear and uncertainty, doubt. Characters don't know what's actually going on. Conflict happens when they're trying to figure out what's actually going on. Bad stuff happens to them, stuff that they didn't expect. So the balance between those two, the dramatic conflict and tension, without resolving what's actually going on, without making it easy for them, without settling or de-escalating any of the conflict. And also, whenever possible, you have to make it hurt as much as possible. It can't just be bad shit that's happening. It has to be physically, emotionally scarring for your main characters, which means your main characters has to care what happens. It has to be about characters that you've already built up with sympathy, so that your readers care what happens to your characters. It has to be characters that your main character, your protagonist cares about. It has to be stakes that are painful, not just for her, but for other people that she cares about. She has to feel guilty. Usually what happens is the first half of the novel, she's reacting to shit. So she doesn't necessarily feel responsibility, but towards after the first half, the midpoint is where they shift from victim to hero. So they start making deliberate choices now that they kind of know what's actually going on, or they think they know what's going on at the midpoint. they also bear more responsibility. So they're starting to make informed choices, but they still will fail. Only now they will fail even bigger. I didn't really mention this earlier, but you also have to make sure your conflict is escalating. So the first conflict, the first action scenes have to be little scenes, like a little bit of bullying, a little bit of like potential tension to build up the world. But you don't want like the really big stuff to happen, the big dramatic stuff to happen until towards the end. So you also want to be careful. I was reading something today where like immediately in the first chapter, she's already crying because she's remembering the backstory about what happened to her sister. And that's really important backstory. You want to have that kind of stuff in your book. So sometimes what happens is I'll tell a writer like you need to put this in, but then it'll just be too much too early. So you want to have the sympathy where you mention that something terrible happened to her sister, but you don't want to actually give away what happened. You don't want to give away too much information. You just want to hint that she has a tragic past, that she's dealing with some tragic past, but you don't want her to cry about it, because that means she's an emotional wreck who's crying every day. And if this happened, years ago, she should be, healed over. Because what you're going to do in the process of the novel is rip open all her old wounds. You want to have her like trying to cope and trying to cover up her heart. Maybe she's been hurt before. She has all this tragic history past, so she doesn't, she's blunt. She's cold. She doesn't warm up to people. She doesn't open her heart to people. She cuts herself off from relationships or emotions. She tries to close her heart off because she's been hurt in the past. That's a good, strong character. But then through the course of the novel, you're going to rip off all those scars and make her really feel the pain again by bringing up all that tragic stuff that happened in the past and making it relevant to the story quest. I wrote something recently on Urban Epics about Roswell. I don't know if you've watched the Roswell reboot that just came out. It's kind of a cheesy TV reboot. It's not amazing, but they do a really good job with TV serials, and especially with what's the word for episode 1? Pilot. So in this pilot episode, something happened to her sister a long time ago, 10 years ago, that made her leave town. She comes back to town. There's all this conflict already going on, tons and tons of conflict. She finds out that her high school boyfriend is actually an alien. So that's all new conflict for the setup. And then at the end of the pilot, the twist is that her new alien love interest was responsible for what happened to her sister 10 years ago. So now there's this huge bit of conflict because as their romance blossoms, he's lying to her. And if she finds out what he really knows about what happened to her sister, that would all come apart. So because readers know that, because viewers know that, there's tension in everything that happens. So you want to always be setting up tension by withholding information from the main character, from the protagonist. And it has to be relevant in an emotionally gripping way, not only to the main character, but also to the story. It has to be relevant to the way the story is going to evolve later on. And eventually, of course, she's going to find out, and then she'll hate that guy, so it'll split them apart. So I hope this video helps. There's two other things. It's not really a good place for this video, but even with this knowledge, I've seen people have the right information in their books, and it's just not done well. Like the dramatic tension just doesn't pan out. Even though the information is there, the scene is not gripping. It's not an emotionally gripping scene. So I'm going to try to rewrite some stuff and see if I can provide some examples of how to actually write an emotionally gripping scene. And then also, I think I'm going to try to focus on how to write a hook, because what should happen is at the end of every chapter, there's a gripping emotional reveal or hook or pivot or action or something. It doesn't always have to be, like gunshots and explosions and I dive for cover. It can be a reveal. It can be an emotional reveal, or she finds out something else, or like she sees something that makes her panic. That's a good place to cut a scene. So you always want to build up the dramatic tension, and then you want to cut right as soon as you make your protagonist panic. Like as soon as you introduce the new point of conflict that makes your protagonist freak out again. Something, I have like in my course on the bestseller blueprint, I have a guide to writing gripping scenes. And I forget exactly what I said, but there's a way to structure scenes so that they pan out really well. And almost always it's, something happens, the protagonist makes a plan, the protagonist execute the plan, something else bad happens, and that's where you cut the scene. Like it right at the twist, before you give more information, before you build up that new action scene, before you give up all that extra information, you cut it on just a little bit of a hook, like it's just a couple sentences showing the bad twist or the shift. It's not, as soon as you introduce the shift or the twist, then you end it. That's what a hook is. You don't like build it back up for 2 or 3 sentences or paragraphs or pages. As soon as you introduce the new change, that's where you cut, and that's what makes a good hook. I'll probably focus a little more on those 2 other things in future videos in the next few weeks. If you're subscribed to my channel, you'll see those. Otherwise, some of this stuff I don't put on YouTube. I just put it in my bestseller blueprint course, so you can find that somewhere online if you look for it. Hope this helps. Thanks. Bye-bye.